What happens when an unstoppable force of calm meets an immovable object of chaos? When a man who's built his career on saying what everyone's thinking finally sets his sights on the most explosive target in daytime television. When decades of manufactured outrage collide with truth delivered at room temperature. What you're about to witness isn't just commentary. It's not just criticism. It's not even just a roast. This is a masterclass in controlled demolition, where the weapon of choice isn't volume, but devastating truth delivered with the precision of a surgeon and the calm of someone who's already won before the first word leaves his mouth. This is the story of how one man dismantled the most iconic talk show in America without raising his voice, without breaking a sweat, without giving them the satisfaction of a traditional fight. Because when you're dealing with a panel that thrives on manufactured outrage, that feeds on conflict like oxygen, that turns every conversation into a battlefield, the most dangerous thing you can do is refuse to play their game. The most lethal move is to stay calm while everything around you burns. They never saw it coming. And that's exactly what made it legendary. The morning started like every other morning at The View. The studio lights hummed with their familiar electric energy, casting that perfect television glow across the iconic set. Coffee mugs clinked against saucers in the green room. Makeup artists applied final touches. Producers scurried between cameras like worker bees in a hive. Headsets crackling with last-minute adjustments. Cards being shuffled. Teleprompters being tested. 5 chairs sat arranged in their familiar arc. Each one positioned with the precision that comes from years of the same routine. Each seat a throne. Each throne occupied by a different brand of daytime television wisdom. Each host with their role, their persona, their carefully cultivated image of speaking truth to power. Whoopi Goldberg settled into her center seat with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this dance 1,000 times before, 10,000 times. The matriarch, the moderator, the referee, the one who could shut down a conversation with nothing more than a raised eyebrow. And that look, that signature look, that said she'd seen it all, heard it all, survived it all, and wasn't impressed by any of it. She adjusted her microphone, straightened her notes, exchanged pleasantries with the crew members she'd known for years. This was her domain, her kingdom, her show. Even if the title card listed other names. The other hosts found their positions, each slipping into their designated role in the daily performance, like actors in a play that had been running for years. The energy in the studio was electric in that manufactured way that comes from years of practice. A carefully calibrated chaos that somehow passed for conversation. Controlled spontaneity. Rehearsed authenticity. The paradox that made The View what it was. Stage managers counted down. Cameras went live. The familiar theme music played. And another episode began just like all the others. Or so they thought. But somewhere miles away from that studio, in a completely different building, on a completely different show, Tyrus was having his own conversation. Not with them, not to them, not even about them at first. Just speaking his mind the way he always did. With that unbothered heavyweight champion energy that made everything sound like he was ordering lunch while simultaneously ending careers. He sat in his chair with that casual authority that can't be taught or faked. The posture of someone who's been in the ring, who's faced real adversity, who's built everything from the ground up and doesn't need anyone's approval to know his own worth. His co-hosts chatted around him. The conversation flowed naturally, organically, the way real discussions do when people aren't performing for effect. And then someone mentioned The View. It was innocent enough. A passing reference. A throwaway comment. The kind of thing that usually leads nowhere. But with Tyrus, you could never quite tell. That's what made him dangerous. He had this way of making surgical strikes feel like casual observations. This ability to dismantle entire worldviews while sounding like he was discussing the weather. Those who knew him, really knew him, recognized the slight shift in his energy, the barely perceptible change in his tone. The way his eyes focused just a little differently. The warning signs were there for anyone paying attention. This wasn't going to be just another hot take. This was going to be something else entirely. The View, he said, his voice carrying that signature low-key rumble that somehow conveyed more authority than 1,000 shouting matches ever could. The way he said it, those 2 words carried weight. History. Observation. Judgment. The studio around him seemed to lean in slightly. His co-hosts sensed something. The crew behind the cameras paused in their work. Even the air felt different, charged with anticipation. Little did anyone know, This calm beginning was about to become the spark for one of the most talked-about roasts in recent television history. Not because of what would happen in person, but because of how devastating truth sounds when delivered without malice, without anger, without any of the theatrical tools The View typically use to control the narrative. Because here's the thing about confronting chaos. You don't meet it with more chaos. You don't fight fire with fire. You don't engage on their terms. You meet it with cold, calculated calm. You let them shout while you speak. You let them perform while you observe. You let them chase drama while you deliver truth. And nobody, absolutely nobody, did calm quite like Tyrus. The mechanism was simple but brutal in its effectiveness. While The View was busy being The View, doing their daily dance of interruptions and contradictions, building their kingdom of controlled chaos, Tyrus was across town dismantling their entire operation with the surgical precision of someone who'd been watching this circus for far too long and finally decided to say what everyone else was thinking. "You know what The View needs?" he asked. And there it was. The setup. Clean. Simple. Devastating in its restraint. A question that sounded genuine, but was actually a loaded weapon. His co-hosts waited. The audience waited. The internet, though it didn't know it yet, was about to collectively hold its breath. They don't need to find Trump supporters. The pause was deliberate. Perfect. The silence stretched just long enough to build tension, to create space for what came next. They need to fire their race baiters. The words hung in the air like a truth bomb with a delayed fuse. Not shouted, not screamed, not delivered with theatrical outrage or performative anger. Just stated with the kind of matter-of-fact delivery you'd use to point out that water is wet or the sky is blue, or that the emperor, despite everyone's insistence to the contrary, isn't actually wearing any clothes. But here's where it got really interesting, because Tyrus wasn't done. He was just getting started, building his case brick by brick, each one laid with the meticulous care of someone who knew exactly what he was constructing. A master architect demolishing a house of cards. "You've had people on there before," he continued, his tone never wavering from that dangerous calm. The kind of calm that's more threatening than any amount of yelling. "You had McCain on there. You've had people who tried to bring different perspectives, different viewpoints, different voices." Another pause. Let it breathe. Let the audience connect the dots themselves. And you ran them off. The observation cut deeper than any shouting match ever could because it was true, verifiably, undeniably, painfully true. And when you're dealing with truth, volume becomes irrelevant. Theatrics become unnecessary. You just state the facts and let them do the heavy lifting. "So, the racist ones who want to stick to this," he said. And now the gloves were coming off, still delivered with that same unbothered energy, still sounding like he was discussing the weather. "Whoopi and Sonny and what's her name? Brocasby Midler." The nickname landed with comedic precision. Not cruel, but cutting. Not mean, but accurate. The kind of observation that makes people laugh and wince at the same time because it's too true to dismiss, but too harsh to fully embrace. Somewhere in that View studio, you could almost feel the seismic shift. Not that they were there to hear it, not that it mattered in that moment, because Tyrus wasn't talking to them. He was talking about them. And somehow that was infinitely more devastating. The beauty of it was in what he didn't do. He didn't yell. He didn't curse. He didn't engage in the theatrical outrage that The View ran on like fossil fuel. He didn't perform. He didn't posture. He didn't pretend. He just pointed out the obvious, spoke the unspeakable, named the unnamed, and let gravity do the rest. "The weird thing about The View," he added with that trademark dry humor, the delivery so deadpan it took a second for the punchline to register, was that Dylan Mulvaney was the most feminine person there. Boom. Not a shout, not a scream, not a theatrical delivery designed for applause. Just an observation delivered with the kind of comedic timing that makes people spit out their coffee and scramble for the replay button. The room erupted in laughter. Not mean-spirited cackling, but the kind of genuine, surprised laughter that comes from hearing something so unexpected, yet so perfectly observed, that you can't help but react. Back at the View studio, business continued as usual. They had no idea what was coming. How could they? They were too busy being exactly what Tyrus was describing at that very moment. 5 voices trying to outvolume each other, each one convinced they held the moral high ground while standing in a valley of their own contradictions. Whoopi gesticulated with that commanding presence she'd cultivated over decades. The others nodded, agreed, disagreed, interrupted each other with the practiced choreography of people who'd turned debate into a contact sport. The cameras captured it all. The audience reacted on cue. The producers monitored from the control room. Just another day at The View, but the clock was ticking. The internet was already moving. Social media algorithms were already picking up the signal. Clips were being shared. Screenshots were being taken. And Tyrus's words were spreading like wildfire through a dry forest, catching on every branch of social media, growing hotter with each share, each retweet, each comment. "It's only in America," Tyrus continued, really hitting his stride now, building momentum with each sentence. "Can a black person sit on a TV show getting paid millions and millions of dollars to have the floor, to interrupt people, to speak freely without consequence?" He leaned into the irony with the precision of a surgeon making an incision. Every word chosen carefully, every phrase designed for maximum impact. And then compare their life to Iran, where interrupting and speaking in public would have led to a stoning. The ignorance of it. The sheer, breathtaking ignorance. The logic was unassailable. The delivery impeccable. The effect absolutely devastating. This wasn't a roast. This was an autopsy. And Tyrus was calmly pointing out every cause of death, while the patient insisted it was still alive and thriving. "You live in a country where you might feel a certain way," he said. And now he was building to something bigger, something more profound. "But here's the one thing about America that makes it different from anywhere else. You have an opportunity, a real opportunity, a chance to succeed, to grow, to build something." Pause for effect. Even if you're as dumb as, he didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone knew what he meant. Everyone could fill in the blank. The unsaid words hung in the air more powerfully than anything he could have actually stated. The escalation was happening, but not in the way The View would recognize or know how to counter. There were no raised voices, no dramatic gestures, no theatrical staging. Just truth piling on top of truth, each one heavier than the last, until the weight became impossible to ignore, impossible to dismiss, impossible to deflect. "Hire them and bring people in," Tyrus continued. And now he was offering solutions even as he tore down the existing structure. Not just destroying, but showing a better way. Maybe you could get McCain to come back. She was a Republican, but every show and every break, she was nearly in tears because she was being attacked. Let that image sink in. Let people visualize it. Not debated. Not disagreed with. Attacked. The picture he painted was vivid and damning. A woman driven to tears, not by robust debate, but by relentless bullying, by a panel so convinced of their righteousness that they couldn't see their own cruelty, so wrapped up in their moral superiority that they'd become the very thing they claimed to oppose. So the problem is, and here his voice took on an even more serious tone, still calm but weighted with the gravity of the point he was making. You have to go after the racist people. And if the CEO goes, "You know what? I'm not going to allow a woman on my show or man that will go after white America and talk about them like dogs. That doesn't represent our ideals or values for anyone, and gets rid of those people. This will clear up real quick." The solution was simple, obvious even: apply the same standards equally. Treat racism as racism regardless of who's expressing it. Hold everyone to the same ethical bar, and absolutely impossible for The View to accept, because it would require looking in a mirror they'd been avoiding for years. Acknowledging patterns they'd spent years denying. Admitting flaws they'd spent careers insisting didn't exist. "You have to actually look in the mirror and clean up your own backyard," Tyrus said, driving the point home with the relentlessness of someone who knew he was right and didn't need anyone's validation to prove it. "Get the racist people out, because that's who you allowed in. You allowed black racists on TV who could just go all day and say anything they want about white people, and nobody stops them." The double standard laid bare. The hypocrisy exposed. The contradiction impossible to ignore. The words echoed across the internet, through social media feeds, into living rooms across America. People who'd been thinking the exact same thing for years suddenly had a voice. And that voice was delivered with the calm authority of someone who refused to be shouted down, refused to be intimidated, refused to back down from truth simply because truth was uncomfortable. At the View studio, the first tremors of the earthquake were starting to reach the surface. Producers glanced at their phones between segments, their faces registering confusion, then concern, then something approaching panic. Social media managers watched in real time as Tyrus's commentary went viral, the numbers climbing exponentially. The panic was setting in, but slowly, like water seeping through a crack that would eventually become a flood. Whoopi, veteran of 1,000 controversies, survivor of countless storms, sensed something. That sixth sense that comes from decades in the public eye, from navigating countless scandals, from reading the temperature of public opinion before it becomes obvious to everyone else. Something was different about today. The energy had shifted in a way she couldn't quite identify, but definitely felt. But the show went on. It always did. That was the rule. The cardinal rule of live television. No matter what's happening outside, the show continues inside. The thing about The View is that it's built on a foundation of performative outrage. Every episode follows the same formula, the same predictable pattern. Find a controversy. Stake out positions. Interrupt each other until commercial break. Return from commercial. Repeat the cycle. It's less a discussion and more a verbal WWE match, except with more coffee, fewer coherent thoughts, and everyone somehow convinced they're doing important work. And Tyrus had just pointed out that the emperor wasn't wearing clothes, that the whole operation was built on shifting sand, that the moral authority they claimed was nothing more than selective outrage and convenient amnesia. She has an opportunity tomorrow, he said, referencing Whoopi specifically now, making it personal in a way that couldn't be ignored or deflected. They won't fire her over that. She's too big, too established, too protected by the institution. She'll have an opportunity tomorrow to come on and fix it. To address what she said, to clarify, to apologize, to make it right. Pause. Let the anticipation build. Will she? Another pause. Shorter this time. Rhetorical question becoming statement. She won't. The prophecy was delivered with the confidence of someone who'd seen this movie before and knew exactly how it ended. Who understood the patterns, recognized the psychology, predicted the response before it happened. But that's the thing about this country, he continued. Black, white, gay, straight, short, tall, rich, poor. Everyone's going to get hit with something. Everyone's going to face criticism. Everyone's going to encounter opposition. Building to the finish. But the beauty about this country is there's always an opportunity for you to better yourself, to grow, to change, to acknowledge your mistakes and become something better. And then the final nail, the coup de grace, the moment everyone would remember. So shame on you, Whoopi. Play the black card somewhere else, because that don't work here in America. Boom. Mic drop. Career ended. Except not really, because Whoopi wasn't going anywhere, and Tyrus knew it. That was part of the brilliance of his approach. He wasn't trying to cancel anyone. He wasn't calling for boycotts or demanding resignations. He was just holding up a mirror and forcing them to look at their own reflection. Forcing America to look at what this show had become. The irony was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. A show that claimed to speak truth to power couldn't handle truth being spoken about them. A panel that demanded accountability from everyone else recoiled at the suggestion they might need to be accountable themselves. Women who made careers out of calling out double standards couldn't see the massive double standard they'd created. And lo and behold, Tyrus continued with that dry humor that made everything funnier, that deadpan delivery that turned observation into comedy gold. They forgot that there's a lot of people at home, white people at home during the day, that are not watching your show anymore. The ratings argument, the business case, the undeniable reality that their approach wasn't just morally questionable, it was commercially failing. So just clean it up. It's that simple. Just clean it up. Practical. Direct. Impossible to misunderstand. By now, The View's production team was in full crisis mode. Not because anything had happened on their show. Not because they'd made any mistakes in this particular episode, but because the internet was on fire with Tyrus's commentary. Clips were being shared millions of times. Think pieces were being written in real time. Conservative outlets were celebrating. Liberal outlets were scrambling to defend. The conversation had shifted, and they weren't controlling it anymore. That was the real threat, not what Tyrus said, but the fact that people were listening, agreeing, sharing. The narrative had escaped their control. Whoopi's phone buzzed. Then buzzed again. And again. And again. The modern telltale sign that something was happening. Something big. Something that would require a response, a strategy, a coordinated defense. But what could she say? How do you respond to someone who hasn't attacked you personally, but rather pointed out systemic issues with surgical precision? How do you fight calm with chaos when calm has already won? How do you deflect criticism that's fundamentally true? The answer, it turned out, was that you don't, not directly, not honestly. You use the tools you've always used. Deflection, misdirection, claiming misunderstanding, playing the victim. Over the next few days, The View tried to address it without addressing it. They used vague language like some people and certain commentators. As if the audience didn't know exactly who they were talking about, as if Tyrus's name wasn't trending, as if the clips weren't everywhere. They spoke in code, hiding behind euphemisms, dancing around the actual points, proving Tyrus's point about their inability to have direct, honest conversations about uncomfortable truths. Whoopi gave one of her patented speeches about resilience and perspective, carefully avoiding any direct engagement with the specific criticisms. It was a masterclass in deflection, a skill she'd honed over decades in the spotlight through countless controversies, surviving scandals that would have ended lesser careers. But the deflection only made it worse, because everyone could see what she was doing. Everyone could hear what she wasn't saying. The silence around the specific points was deafening. And in that silence, in that refusal to engage directly, she confirmed everything Tyrus had said. The panel rallied around her as they always did. They formed a protective circle, a wagon formation against the incoming truth bombs. They doubled down on their approach, their perspectives, their conviction that they were on the right side of history, that their critics were motivated by bigotry or ignorance or political bias. And with each defensive move, with each deflection, with each refusal to engage with the substance of the criticism, they proved Tyrus's point more completely than any argument ever could. The best defense would have been honest engagement, direct acknowledgement, genuine self-reflection. But that would require admitting they might be wrong, and that was the one thing they couldn't do. Meanwhile, across town, in a different studio, on a different show, Tyrus went about his day, did his show, made his points, cracked his jokes, moved on to the next topic, unbothered, unruffled, victorious in that quiet way that's more devastating than any loud celebration. Because he'd done what nobody else had the guts to do. He'd called out the view not with anger but with accuracy, not with volume but with precision, not with theatrics but with truth. Not as a political statement, but as an obvious observation. The beauty of his approach was its simplicity. He didn't need elaborate schemes or gotcha moments. He didn't need to manufacture drama or create controversy. He just pointed at the obvious and said, "Look, see that? That's a problem. Let's call it what it is." And once he pointed it out, it couldn't be unseen. The spell was broken. The curtain pulled back. The emperor's nakedness on full display. The View continued doing what The View does best, pretending nothing had happened while everything had changed. They kept their format, their energy, their conviction that they spoke for millions of Americans who totally agreed with everything they said. But something was different now. Fundamentally different. The spell had been broken. The magic trick exposed. The curtain had been pulled back. And behind all the righteous indignation and moral superiority, people could now see what had always been there but rarely acknowledged. A show that preached tolerance while practicing exclusion, that demanded diversity while enforcing conformity, that claimed to speak truth while running from it. Tyrus had held up a mirror, and the reflection wasn't flattering. But more than that, he'd given permission. Permission for others to notice. Permission to speak up. Permission to call out what they'd been seeing all along. In coffee shops and living rooms across America, conversations were happening. Water cooler discussions, family dinner debates, social media arguments. People who'd felt gaslit for years suddenly felt validated. People who'd been told they were wrong for noticing the double standards suddenly had permission to say so. Because if Tyrus could point it out with such calm authority, maybe they weren't crazy after all. Maybe the emperor really wasn't wearing clothes. Maybe The View really had become the exact thing it claimed to oppose. The viral moment wasn't a traditional confrontation. There was no face-to-face showdown, no dramatic walkout, no explosive exchange of insults, no moment where someone stormed off set or threw down a microphone. It was something far more devastating. A calm, collected dismantling of an entire worldview, delivered with the precision of someone who'd thought deeply about the issues and couldn't be dismissed as just another angry voice with an axe to grind. Tyrus had won by refusing to fight on their terms. He dominated by staying calm. He destroyed by simply telling the truth in a way that couldn't be spun, couldn't be deflected, couldn't be dismissed. And The View, they kept doing their show, kept having their arguments, kept interrupting each other, kept performing their daily ritual of controlled chaos. But they did it in the shadow of someone who'd shown there was another way, a better way, a way that didn't require shouting or performing or pretending. Just truth, calmly stated. Impossible to refute. That's the power of the calm roast. It doesn't give you anything to fight against. It doesn't provide the drama you need to deflect. It doesn't offer the theatrical confrontation you can spin or reframe. It just sits there, undeniable and unmoved, waiting for you to either acknowledge it or prove its point by avoiding it. The View chose avoidance. And in doing so, they gave Tyrus his most complete victory. Not because he destroyed them, but because they destroyed themselves trying not to acknowledge what he'd said. Weeks later, people were still talking about it. Not because anything dramatic had happened. Not because there was an ongoing feud or escalating war of words, but because something true had been said. And in an era of performance and pretense, of carefully crafted narratives and strategic positioning, truth delivered without agenda or anger cuts through everything else like a hot knife through butter. Whoopi went on with her career as she always would. The View continued its daily dance of controlled chaos. Ratings fluctuated. Controversies came and went. The cycle continued. But everyone who'd heard Tyrus's commentary couldn't quite watch the show the same way anymore. The magic trick had been exposed. The formula revealed. The pretense shattered. Every interruption now seemed calculated. Every moral pronouncement rang hollow. Every claim to speak for America felt presumptuous. And somewhere, probably sipping coffee and not thinking about any of this, probably focused on his next show or his next project, Tyrus just smiled that knowing smile. The smile of someone who'd said what needed to be said exactly how it needed to be said, and then moved on with his life. Because that's the thing about truth. Once it's spoken, it doesn't need defending. It doesn't need volume. It doesn't need drama. It doesn't need follow-up or clarification or spin. It just needs to be heard. And Tyrus had made sure everyone heard it loud and clear. Despite never raising his voice, perfectly understood. Despite never over-explaining, impossible to forget. Despite being delivered with casual calm. That's mastery. That's power. That's how you win without fighting. Dominate without shouting. And change the conversation without changing your tone. The aftermath of the Tyrus commentary became its own phenomenon, a cultural moment that transcended the original statement. Social media exploded with reactions, memes, and endless debates. People who'd never heard of Tyrus suddenly knew his name. People who'd never watched The View suddenly had strong opinions about it. Political commentators weighed in. Entertainment reporters dissected every angle. The story had legs, as they say in the business, and it ran marathon distance. The panel tried to move forward, but every episode now carried the weight of what had been said. Every interruption was noticed and commented on. Every double standard highlighted by eagle-eyed viewers. Every claim of speaking for Americans questioned by those same Americans who'd never felt represented by the show. Whoopi, to her credit, maintained her composure publicly. She'd survived worse storms in her long career. Controversies that would have sunk others barely registered on her RTOR scale, but even she couldn't ignore the shift in perception. The shield of unquestioned moral authority had developed cracks, and no amount of righteousness could seal them. The other hosts rallied. They defended their positions. They explained their perspectives. They insisted they'd always been fair, always been balanced, always been willing to hear all sides. The protests rang increasingly hollow as people compared the claims to the receipts, the promises to the patterns. But the tape didn't lie. The patterns didn't disappear. And Tyrus's calm commentary had given permission for others to notice what they'd been noticing all along, but felt unable to articulate or afraid to express. That was the real power of what he'd done. Not destroying The View, that would be impossible and honestly unnecessary, but rather he'd given voice to the thousands, maybe millions, who'd been watching and thinking the exact same things, but didn't have the platform or the confidence to say so. He'd been the kid pointing at the naked emperor, calm and unbothered, stating the obvious, while everyone else pretended not to see. And once one person says it, once the spell is broken, everyone else suddenly feels free to acknowledge reality. Television personalities and commentators from across the spectrum weighed in. Some defended The View with varying degrees of conviction. Some praised Tyrus with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Some tried to find middle ground, to both sides the issue, to suggest everyone had valid points. But almost everyone acknowledged that something significant had happened. A boundary had been crossed. A conversation had been opened. A truth had been spoken that couldn't be unspoken, couldn't be walked back, couldn't be memory holed. And through it all, Tyrus remained exactly who he'd always been. Calm, collected, unbothered by the storm he'd created. He'd made his point, delivered his message, spoken his truth, and then moved on, leaving others to debate and dissect and discuss while he focused on the next thing, the next show, the next moment. That's the mark of someone who speaks from conviction rather than calculation. Someone who says what they believe because they believe it, not because they're trying to go viral or start a movement or build a brand around controversy. The irony is that by not trying to create a moment, he created one of the biggest moments in recent talk show history. By refusing to engage in traditional conflict, he'd won a decisive victory. By staying calm, he'd created more impact than 1,000 shouting matches. The View would continue. Tyrus would continue. And the conversation about media bias, double standards, selective outrage, and who really speaks for America would continue, probably forever, because these are eternal questions without easy answers. But it would never be quite the same. Because someone had finally said what needed to be said in exactly the way it needed to be said, without anger, without agenda, without performance. Calm, collected, devastating. That's how you dismantle an empire without raising your voice. That's how you win a fight without throwing a punch. That's how you speak truth to power when power has forgotten how to listen to truth. What started as commentary became a cultural moment. What was meant as criticism became a referendum. What began as one man speaking his mind became a movement of people who felt finally someone had said what they'd been thinking for years. And The View, they learned the hard way that sometimes the most dangerous opponent isn't the one screaming at you from across the table. It's the one calmly dismantling your entire worldview from a different room entirely, not even giving you the satisfaction of a traditional fight, not even acknowledging that there's a battle happening. Tyrus had held up the mirror. The reflection was harsh, unflattering, impossible to ignore. And no amount of deflection, no amount of spin, no amount of righteous indignation could change what everyone could now clearly see. The question wasn't whether he was right or wrong. The facts spoke for themselves. The question was whether anyone would have the courage to look in that mirror and actually see what was reflected there, to acknowledge the truth instead of deflecting from it. Most wouldn't. Most would keep performing, keep posturing, keep pretending that volume equals validity and conviction equals correctness and moral certainty equals actual morality. But some would. Some would pause, reflect, question their assumptions, maybe even change their perspective, their approach, their understanding. And that possibility, however slim, however unlikely, made the whole thing worth it. Because in the end, that's what truth does. It doesn't force change. It doesn't demand anything. It doesn't require acknowledgement or validation. It just exists, undeniable and patient, waiting for those brave enough to acknowledge it, strong enough to accept it, wise enough to learn from it. Tyrus had done his part. He'd spoken the truth with the calm authority of someone who knew he was right and didn't need validation to prove it. The rest was up to everyone else. And as he moved on to the next topic, the next show, the next moment, he left behind a perfect example of how to win an argument without arguing, how to dominate a conversation without shouting, and how to change minds without changing your tone. Just truth delivered cold, served calmly, landing perfectly. The most powerful weapon in any arsenal, more effective than anger, more lasting than outrage, more devastating than any theatrical performance. And Tyrus had just reminded everyone why. Not by trying to teach a lesson, but by living one. Not by preaching about communication, but by demonstrating it. Not by explaining his philosophy, but by embodying it. That's legacy. That's impact. That's how you make a difference without making a scene. How you create change without creating chaos. How you speak truth without speaking down. The final word wasn't loud. It was barely a whisper. But it echoed across the landscape of American media, changing the conversation, shifting the narrative, giving voice to the voiceless. And in the end, that's all anyone can ask for. Not victory, not vindication, not validation. Just truth spoken clearly, heard widely, remembered always.